Good evening, friends. Good evening, friends. We're being recorded. And my name is George Shaffer, and I am the Care and Aging Coordinator for Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. And you all as members of the monthly meeting of Friends of Philadelphia, are part of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. Um, Although Quakers are probably, the least hierarchical uh, religious body, we do have monthly, quarterly, and yearly meeting. And traditionally, it has been that you become a Quaker by becoming a member of a meeting. But just this past July, we're starting something new at yearly meeting, something called at-large membership. So that should be something interesting. But it's illustrative of the fact that friends are open to new ways of doing things, even though we may struggle and it may take time. We do try to be flexible because we have this core belief that we can be guided as individuals and as a community by the Spirit of God. Um, and we'll talk about beliefs, um, and we'll talk about knowing. So those two things, because very often when people come to Quakers, they say, "Well, what do Quakers believe?" And Quakers are usually hesitant to declaim or affirm a creed because we're non-creedal. So Quakers will say, "Well, we have an experience that has led us to have this kind of understanding." Some Quakers will say, "Well, we believe in that of God in every person." That would be the core value, that there's some divine spark, there's some essence, something, and we try not to nail that down either because it's a language thing and language is metaphor, and metaphors are not exactly able to describe something that is ineffable. So we say that of God is within everyone, and that of God, that divine essence that can guide us, is available to everyone. There's no intermediary required, and that the truth that's revealed to us is something that can guide our lives. And we bring that truth and that experience to community for testing. So the individual and community are bound pretty tightly in Quaker process. We call Quaker process the way we do this discernment. Very important word. Discernment, clearness, really finding clarity. Those are early expressions that Quakers, the Friends, have used for hundreds of years to talk about how do we know that we're being guided by Spirit in the way that is going to be helpful, and in a way that promotes love, in a way that promotes well-being and functioning. Just to kind of go back to the beginning, Quakers were started in, people will say, date 1652. So just in the aftermath of the English Civil War, Quakers arose. And at that time, there were a lot of sects that arose in response to the Civil War and the social chaos. Diggers, grounders, levelers, Quakers, one of them, one of the groups. Quakers have survived those years, probably to do with the organizational genius of a woman named Margaret Fell, who helped to create the system that we still continue to use today. So what do Quakers know, and how do we know what we know? What's our epistemology, if you will? How do we know? Well, as I mentioned, we don't have a creed. So then, if you don't have a creed, then what is the thing that gets us to know that we're Quakers? Well, if you don't have a creed, then behavior, how you behave, is going to be a big indication of whether or not you're part of the group, if you will. So Quakerism it has a behavioral element, and if you're new to Quakerism, and if you've been shopping for a church, if you go to other churches, after you've been attending for a month or so, they'll say, "Hey, how would you like to be a member?" and they'll, give you a card to fill out and want to, set up a time to meet with you. With friends, we usually say, well, take your time. Don't don't rush into anything. Hang out, come to the community, get involved in any way you can, in any way that feels good, and get to see how we do things, because how we do things is kind of unique. Again, it's heavily informed by this process of knowing and of being guided. And it also, we do talk about God, and whether we talk about how we describe that word or what that word means to individual Quakers is going to vary greatly. And as a religious tradition, we're in what's called the liberal Friends tradition. And liberal, it's not so much what people use that word to mean today, like politically liberal. It goes back to more the 19th century term of the individual having equal weight to the community, so that the individual can challenge the community and the community can challenge the individual. But at one time, it was not that way. During a period that's often described as the quietist period, so say the third generation of Quakers, right up until the beginning of the 20th century, conformity, group conformity, was much more the ethos. And so people that didn't conform to the group were then told that they couldn't be part of the group. And Quakers, that was not such a good strategy, especially after the Civil War. The American Civil War changed everything for Quakers, because a large percentage, I think maybe 2/3 of young Quaker men enlisted to fight for the Union cause, and they came back after the war, and they had other views. They started dressing not in the plain dress that some of you may, the man on the Quaker Oats box, that kind of dressing. They rejected a lot of that, and they also started to marry, men and women started to marry people that were not Quakers. So it became, the way that the community functioned then started to become much more amorphous. And the other big part of that is that the testimonies, what we call the testimonies, and again, think behaviorally. So a testimony is a witness. So you're living your life, you're witnessing to a set of principles or a set of guiding principles, and those the witness can take certain form. And for friends, it has taken a nonviolent pacifist, refusing to conform to the world and the ways of war. So that's our most salient testimony that friends are known for. But again, all of us as friends are going to have a different understanding of how we witness our lives to that testimony. There's no standard of conformity that we enforce on all the members of a meeting. So some people, we often struggle with the testimonies. In our society, with the way things are arranged, many of us struggle with the idea of simplicity. And we don't enforce an ethos, so to speak, although we maybe do it unconsciously. When you come to a Quaker meeting of a Sunday morning, you're probably going to find a group of people that are dressed fairly simply, and going to try to express themselves in a fairly direct way. This is another behavioral trait that friends tend to be direct in their speech, and we're encouraged to be direct in our speech to understand what it is we feel, and then to express that clearly. Um, and if you do come to, if you get involved in a Quaker meeting, if something doesn't sit right with you, you'll often be asked to explain. You'll tell us why. And so you you have to be prepared for that. Um, and when I talk about the divine or talk about God, I'm not so much talking about this vertical relationship with spirit that goes this way, which is a metaphor in our society that people, they say, oh, thank God, they look up at the sky. But for modern liberal friends, it's this horizontal plane. So we know God in relationship to one another. And these ideas might sound a little, you know, on the radical end of Christianity, and certainly they are. But they are to be found in Scripture as well. How can you say you love God if you cannot love one another? Which is a quote from the letter of James. So a lot of Quaker peculiarity and behavioral sort of ways can be found in the Gospels, in the writings of the New Testament. But the key thing for Friends was that they believed that the gospel is a method and a message. So it's not just the message. There's a method there. There's something going on there. The way people are behaving, the way they're doing their business. And if you read it closely, if you read it sort of like an anthropologist, what are they doing? How are they resolving conflict? What's happening next? How are people traveling in the ministry? What is what's the message that they're trying to get out? Now, I don't know if I mentioned George Fox, but he's always the person we think of as the original founder of Quakerism, and Margaret Fell, who later became his wife, was the organizational genius behind the movement. But for George Fox, the biggest sin, so to speak, if to use that word, was self-delusion. So we all have a marvelous capacity to delude ourselves, to think that we are holy or think that we are righteous, when in fact, we're not always righteous. And so the Quaker spiritual formation that occurs in community is a very humbling process, because most of us think we're right about things, and then we have to submit to the will of the community, and oftentimes we're not right, and that's so dealing with ambiguity and the ambiguity of language. So a phrase that I would like to have our theme around is listening to the light. Listening to the light, old Quaker expression, right? Listening to the light. So that's a great expression, because when do you listen to the light? Like you can't listen. You see the light, or you listen to a voice. But listening to the light it's a kind of a Quaker way to mix that metaphor so that you don't become locked into it as, this is the way it should be. Because every metaphor has its limitations. And we're talking about the ineffable, we're talking about spirit, we're talking about the divine, which is also ineffable. And locking in with metaphors and creeds and, all that, it puts a hedge around God. And we don't want to do that. And certainly, again, you have to remember Quakers coming about in the English Civil War, when there were all these sects and people fighting and people killing each other over words. And so early Friends said, look, the words are really not that important. And George Fox used an array of metaphors: the light, the seed, the voice, there's many metaphors, and they would all mix them up as well. And, when we talk about light today, we have to look at things like racism and white and black and colorism, and is talking about the light all the time. As friends, we do that. I mean, I love that metaphor. Um, but is it, what's the message that we're sending? Um, but so that the metaphors that Quakers used usually are kind of embodied. So this is another important aspect of Quakerism. Quakerism is an embodied spirituality. It happens in our bodies. It happens with other bodies, and together we make this happen. So in the ritual, we bring our body, we bring our experience, we bring our consciousness, we bring our awareness, we bring our presence to being with others. And as we know from neuroscience and other research, that changes us when we're with others. Our neurological wiring changes. We connect to others. There's all this research now on what happens to people when they listen to music together, what happens to people when they sing together. And as many of us know, when Quakers come together to do business and we submit to the larger will of the group, something magical, something unique can happen, and often does happen. And it's usually that experience, it's usually that knowing, if you will, that gets us to want to become closer to the community. Say, okay, there's something happening here, and if you tell people you're a Quaker, that don't know much about Quakerism, they'll often think, okay, well, you must be a nonconformist, and for the most part, I guess you could say we're countercultural in a number of ways, and yet submitting to the will of the group is a very hard thing. Conforming to the will of others, and that's what community is all about. And Americans say they love community, but they don't want anybody to tell them what to do. So that's a struggle that we constantly have to encounter. But again, we are a religion. So listening to the light, and even so think of spirit as accessible to all the senses. I mean, I know for me, when I'm in the spirit, I feel sensation. I feel like an energetic sensations that happen to me. So that would be, touch, a felt sense. And that expression, a felt sense, is also very important to Quaker spirituality. One of our Quaker saints, if you will, was a man named John Woolman, who lived in New Jersey in the mid 18th century, and he was an abolitionist, and he always talked about why he did what he did, which was traveling with a message to friends that about the evils of slavery. People said, "Well, why do you do this, John?" And he said, "Well, I have a felt sense that this is what I'm led to do, because it's wrong." And so that idea of a felt sense, and that idea that spirit can guide us, can lead us, and oftentimes, spirit leads us where we don't want to go. So, and early friends right probably until the early 20th century would have talked about, picking up one's cross, if you will, taking that ministry and the leadings that come from spirit to live more righteously are not always an easy thing. It's not always it's a joyful burden, if you will. John Woolman, going back to John Woolman and others like Lucretia Mott, during the antebellum period when everything was dyed with indigo, which was produced in the Caribbean by slaves, they refused to wear dyed clothing. And so they wore their wool clothing just in its gray, whitish, color. And they stood out in society. And people thought, okay, that's weird. Like, why aren't they dyeing their clothing? But they were making a witness to a leading, and I'm sure it was a little bit embarrassing, and it wasn't drawing attention to yourself is not always a big virtue among Quakers. We always try to kind of fit in and appear nondescript. Um, so yeah, God leads us to understand our relationship with the world, and that leading for us collectively, as I mentioned, is related to the testimonies. And you probably have all heard of the testimonies in one form or another. You go into the meeting house and you see a very plain, simple building. Well, that was, of course, intentional. No stained glass. Um, we're not going to tell you a story that is going to be displayed ostentatiously. But in the same way that um, Quaker spirituality is more of a horizontal experience, um, the the knowing of it is an inward experience. So it's sort of flat and in, if you will. Um, Now, sometimes if you talk to people about spirituality, if you ask them about their spirituality, they'll kind of get private with that, because now in America we know that the majority religious group is none, so no religion, and of the nones of the no religion, the majority of those folks are spiritual but not religious, and so we can talk about that. But what does that mean, spiritual but not religious? Um, and I think when you ask people what do they mean by that, they'll usually say, "Well, that's a private thing. Spirituality is it's a my private relationship with spirit, with creation, with whatever, however we describe what it is that we're a part of." Um, but for friends, we kind of flip that script and we say, "Okay, tell me about your spirituality. Tell me about what's going on with you." And so we have to, even though we have this ineffable spirit experience, we do have to find language to communicate it to one another. And we also tell the story of our own spiritual journey. Now, most religious traditions, most Christian traditions, and in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and even in Islam and Buddhism, they have stories that they tell. We have the story of the founding of Quakerism and the history of Quakerism over the last 350 years. But for the most part, the story that we tell is our lives. The story that we tell is what we've done. George Fox used to go to traditional Church of England services. And in those days, there was a time, because people would go to church for 3 or 4 hours at a clip. And there was a time where people could stand up and testify to whatever had been presented by the priest or the minister. Um, and George Fox would say, "Okay, you told us a story about Paul, and you told us a story about Peter and all these other characters, but what can you say? What canst thou say about spirit moving in your life?" And as you might imagine, that did not go over well. People were like, "Well, what can I say? I'm my authority is the scripture." So this is another huge point, is that so early friends got into a lot of trouble because they were saying, no, the authority is within you. It's not in the priest or the bishop and then the king and, doing all this up and up and up. It's like we're going to flatten everything and the authority is within you. So that idea that people had the authority within themselves was a huge threat to the social structure at the time. And because in those days you had to swear oath and you had to swear allegiance to the king. So saying, "I'm not going to do that." Now, if you said in those days, "I'm not going to do that," then the state would say, "Okay, well, we're cutting you off." And the reason the Quaker marriage ceremony is what it is because Quakers had to come up with a way to marry each other because the state said, "We're not going to do it. We're not going to recognize you guys as a legit body because you're dissenters and you're a threat to the crown and the government." And so not going to work. So Quakers came up with their own way of doing things, and we eventually got it to become accepted. When the state of Pennsylvania and New Jersey were set up as colonial commonwealths, Quakers were allowed to, at that time, had influence. And so you can get married in Pennsylvania using a Quaker license where people marry themselves. There's no officiating higher body. And then that ceremony is witnessed by everyone in the room, rather than some bureaucrat, magistrate. So so that's that idea that spirituality is, while I can be influenced by others, it's also my story. It's also what's going on within me. How do I seek guidance? And how do I know what to do? How am I led? And of course, for us as liberal friends, as in the tradition, the way to do that is through silence. So we go within and we wait. We go within and we wait. And it's an expectant waiting. So we go within ourselves and we wait for spirit to move. We center down, we quiet our minds, we still our bodies. Early Quakers were not so much concerned with silence as they were with stillness. And as we know from neuroscience and research on meditation, still the body, still the mind, quiet the mind, sink down, move into your heart, feel what's going on with you, open up, become vulnerable to the reality of your life. Don't avoid things that are uncomfortable, face uncomfortable truths, and you will be guided to live in a way that brings you peace and serenity through that kind of integration. And that integration then leads to integrity, and that's the basic testimony of Quakerism, of integrity, of living, trying to live, struggling to live in accordance with one's inner principles, one's inner knowing. We all know what's right. We know what the right thing to do is. So Quakers are known for their honesty. Well, that comes out of that integrity as well. We're known for simplicity. Well, that comes out of integrity too, because if I can live simply, there'll be more to go around. We don't want to hoard things. We don't need to hoard things, because if we're in relationship with spirit, there will always be abundance, because we can just move into spirit, find peace, find contentment, and then live lives of integrity and wholeness. So so this idea of being guided is fairly central to Quakerism, and it's one that it's one that we, as when you're new to Quakerism, you sort of have to ease into it, because we're influenced all the time by our society, by the conventions, and by the things that we should do, and so for Quakers, I mentioned that we're a bit countercultural, and we're countercultural in the sense of questioning. Well, why do we do that? Why do we go along with things that are happening that seem to be destructive to people? So that's an important piece, and one key part of that is an understanding that was turned into a phrase by John Woolman, again, our Quaker saint from Mount Holly, New Jersey, where when he was on his leading, doing his work around slavery, he also looked at things like luxury, and he could find the seeds of war if you will, the seeds of war in luxury and in enslavement and in empowerment and in dominance. So, so that phrase, looking for the seeds of war, we use that phrase, um, you know, as a sort of it's a bit of a coded phrase in that it means let's look more deeply at how systems are working and who are they benefiting and who are they not benefiting. So friends often bring that critique to, they bring that critique to social situations. Um, and not that friends haven't benefited from privilege and other kinds of things, um, but it's always a question and it's always a dialogue, and we have to struggle with it as individuals. But how are what is all of what's our wealth based upon? What's our knowledge based upon? What's going on in the system, if you will, that we're a part of, and um, is there some unjustness to it? And of course, like right now in our yearly meeting, we in July we came to unity around um, ego justice, um, racism, and the impact of race, and also the marginalizing of sexual minorities. So those things are um, where we're focusing our attention right now. But certainly, um, for young friends, looking at what we were unaware of. I mean, I'm sure in 100 years, people will look back at our culture, our society, and say, "Wow, they were doing this. What were they thinking?" I just spent some time learning about fast fashion because I was surprised to learn it's like the number 2 polluter in the world, besides fossil fuels. Um, but fashions are changing so rapidly. People change their, and they use vast amounts of water. Actually, this documentary I saw the Ural Sea in Asia has all but disappeared because of the vast amounts of water that are being used to grow cotton to create blue jeans for the markets in Western Europe. Um, so, I mean, it's sort of an example of, okay, let's really look at who's benefiting, what's going on, and how is it impacting you know poor people and people at the local level. And then what can I do? How can I change my behavior? So again, it comes down to, like, I'm not, I wish, you know, we have too many brands of jeans in the world at this point, in my opinion. But that's not something I'm going to change overnight. But my own consumption, I can change. I mean, same thing with food as well, and all these other aspects of how we live in an interconnected way. Uh, so I was I normally I have a PowerPoint presentation that I do, and I break down the our name, Religious Society of Friends, and then so if you travel around, you'll see signs that say, Abington meeting of the Religious Society of Friends, and then either in quotes or in parens, it'll say Quakers or Quaker. Um, and I work for the yearly meeting. We have no letterhead that says Quaker on it. So Quaker's a nickname, and it was a derogatory nickname that sort of stuck. And again, it was that period of time when things were topsy turvy. But the Quaking, you know, Quaking is what we do, and Quaking is that it's that bodily, embodied spirituality that happens to us um, when we start to look within, when we connect with the spirit of truth, the light, the seed, the guide, the inner teacher, the Christ within. Um, that quakes us. That gets us it upsets us. It doesn't. So there's a quote from the Gospel of Thomas, which is a Gnostic gospel, and the quote is that Jesus says to his disciples, you know, you really have to look within, look deeply within. When you look within, you will be upset, but that upsetment will lead to greater understanding. So looking within is always not, looking within it's not all sweetness and light. We look within, we see our own shortcomings. The light reveals, and it also convicts us. And most Quakers nowadays are what's called convinced Quakers, meaning we weren't born and raised Quakers. We were convinced of the truth of Quakerism and joined, became members. But the word convinced, as it was used in the 17th century, and much of Quaker jargon comes from that time, and much of it is legalistic, and it meant to be convicted. So you were convinced of the truth. So you don't convert to Quakerism necessarily, because the truth is always available. It's always accessible. You're not giving over one truth for another. You're just becoming more aware. You're moving deeper into relationship with the truth. So being convinced of the truth is often it's often a struggle. It's not all, it's not all sweetness and light. And oftentimes, as I mentioned earlier, we're led to face uncomfortable things about ourselves and about the society around us. And we have to balance that with with trying to find some serenity and some equanimity as well. So the religious society of France. So there's that word religion, and I mentioned earlier that the largest religious group now in America are people that say they have no religion. And when we think of religion in a spiritual context, it's usually it has a group conformity connotation, so that I'm religious because I'm following the group's norms, and that makes me one. Religion means to rebind, to religare, meaning to ligaments that are rebound, and it's a force that binds the community. But there's also a behavioral piece to it. It's a it's a religion. There are ways of doing things, and certainly, even though when you come to a Quaker meeting, you may be perplexed as to how exactly how does this work? But there is a way that it works, and it's a society. So it's the religious society, meaning that there's a bit of a social contract. There's a contractual relationship. And what is that contractual relationship spiritually? Spiritually, my experience of that is that we all learn about each other from each other. So I learn what my shortcomings are by being in a relationship with Lois and Nancy and Susanna, and we'll work together, and I might say something or they might do something to guide me and show me and gently encourage me. The other word we used to use for hundreds of years was elder, and that's not necessarily a bad word, because sometimes I'm wrong. Sometimes I delude myself about what I think I know and what I do, and sometimes someone needs to tap me on the shoulder and say, "Hey, you know what? You're not getting that right." That's the hardest thing about being in any relationship, as we know, any relationship. Someone is observing you and saying, "Hey, you know what? You're close, but you could use a little. You're perfect the way you are, but you could use a little improvement." That's my favorite Zen saying. You're perfect, but so we're all perfect. We're all one with God. We're all created to be these beautiful manifestations, to be the eyes of God. and yet we all have 180 vision when we should have 360. And so being in community means people have a 360 view of you. And every once in a while they say, hey, you know what? Maybe you're not getting this right. And then, that's the spiritual. Most traditions have a priest or a minister or a guru to do that, to say, hey, you're not quite getting it. And then we say, okay, maybe I'm not getting it. And that's where the spiritual growth comes in. That's where I learn more about myself. So the spiritual journey is ultimately a journey of self-discovery, a journey of submitting to the will of the group, trusting in the will of the group, trusting in spirit, trusting in the guidance of the group. And an old word that Quakers would have used for that experience is surrender or obedience. I think we still use the term surrender, but obedience. And the other part of that is, so the this idea of Quakerism being behavioral, it means that we can't just read a book and get it. We have to do it. You can read Faith and Practice. I like to read it. I mean, if you're out myself as a Quaker nerd, but some of us like to read Faith and Practice, but it's a guidebook, it's a rule book, it's inspirational, it's got, it's a lot of different things. But again, the name itself, Faith and Practice. So it's a practice that you can't, you have to practice it. And there's a nice expression that a Quaker minister from the conservative tradition talks about, which is apprenticing yourself to the meeting. If you're going to become a member, my suggestion would be attend business meeting for 6 months, see what you think. Apprentice yourself to, and by apprentice, apprentice is I guess it's an old-fashioned term, but it had a lot to do with learning through socialization, learning through doing, learning through watching, learning through listening. And that brings us to another core of principle of Quaker spirituality. Quaker spirituality is listening spirituality. So we are here to listen. I mean, and listening is, listening is not easy, because we have to learn how to turn off the mental chatter that's constantly, trying to get us to do the next thing, or look at the next thing, or, scroll to the next thing. So we have to quiet, we have to go within. But listening for friends is a transformative process. And that's the heart of our transformative process. And if you've ever listened to someone, if you've ever listened deeply to someone, or if you've ever been listened to, it was transformative. I mean, I can attest that, when I started coming to meeting when I was a teenager, and then when I was a young adult, I got serious about joining meeting, and the older members at my meeting listened to me with a quality of attention that just felt, just conveyed to me that they loved me, that they were listening to me, they were loving me. And I mean, I don't even remember what I said. I'm sure they don't know. Like, what the words were not as important as just that feeling of empathy, that people were extending themselves emotionally for me, trying to connect. And that And that comes through learning how to listen, learning how to let go of ego, let go of response, just be in the present moment, truly listen to someone's soul. Um, and by that I mean, their their life experience, their feelings, their thoughts, where life has brought them to this moment, and kind of soulfulness. So Quakerism, we often talk about the three parts of bringing ourselves, because before long, and when you become a member of a meeting, your condition, who you are, and your strengths and weaknesses are revealed in the community, and that's just the way it is. People get to know you, and George Fox famously said that he could connect with people because he could understand the conditions of others. So we all bring our woundedness, we bring our whole selves. We don't have to. Very often people think, well, I can't be a Quaker because I'm really not that good. Like, we're just people. We're bringing all of our woundedness and our own frailties to this. But before too long, people will know what your frailties are, and they will continue to love you. I mean, that's the covenant that we make with one another. And if you ever want to fast track people getting to know your frailties, volunteer to be clerk of meeting, and and they will. Everyone will say, well, he does a great job, but I don't know about that. I don't know about this or that or the other thing. But
George,
yeah.
Could I interrupt you? Do you know that I've just become clerk of the meeting?
Well, Nancy, the meeting is so lucky, and you are so lucky that everybody loves you so much. We all love you so much, Nancy, and thank you for taking on that ministry. The yoke is easy and light, is what I hear. I'm just paraphrasing, but yeah, I was, up until a year and a half ago, I was clerk of Abington Meeting for 4 years. That was fun, challenge. So we grow, and we learn, and hopefully we stay connected, and we stay connected in love. The other thing I would just want to touch on briefly before we get to 8 o'clock is Quaker ministry. So ministry does not only include the vocal ministry that's given in the meeting for worship. All the work that we do is ministry, and everyone in the meeting is called to a ministry, and that's how the meeting functions. And you have to discern where you're being called to serve the meeting. But serving the meeting is a usually important thing, which is why we usually ask folks to consider carefully whether they want to be a member or not, because it's a commitment. It's a commitment to discover your ministry, to work with others, and to help the meeting function. There's no other person that's going to do it. So Nancy, this might be helpful. When I was clerk, I would remind the body that I was not the executive director. I was not the person that I was there to help them discern the decision, but I wasn't necessarily the one that was going to carry it out. That's the whole meeting. That's the meeting's job, to make sure that things get done. Because people might come back the next month and say, well, we said we were going to do this. Well, why didn't someone do it? And you're like, okay, well, who would that someone be? Are you being called to do it? Be very careful. I learned this lesson when I was a young Quaker. Standing up a meeting and saying, somebody really ought to do X, Y, and Z. usually everybody would turn to you and say, "Oh, we're so excited you volunteered to do it." You're like, "Well, uh, uh, okay, I guess I'll do it," but there's no other, there's no other group that's going to do it. So, um, so being very careful, but the ministry is lived out in one's personal relationship with spirit and with community, and that's that's the important piece, and that's what makes us a faith community. And sometimes we do a good job, sometimes you don't, sometimes things happen, um, but again, we're here to grow in the school of love, and ultimately, you know people seek out spiritual community for healing. I know I did. I mean, life is a trauma. And forget about the things that happen to us, but as the Buddha said, all life is trauma. I mean, we're constant. We're I mean, that led him into his understanding of impermanence. Everything is passing and moving, and time is swiftly passing, and we're programmed to attach to people and things, and yet they're always changing. That in and of itself is something that needs to be paid close attention to, and most of us need a spiritual practice to not become, to not become always grieving that, and always bitter about that, um, and early friends, um, you know they knew that time passed so quickly, and they didn't, they weren't concerned with their worldly status in it. If you look at early Quaker burial grounds, there are no headstones. Like your parking lot at Arch Street, there are no headstones there. I mean, for a number of reasons. But early friends didn't, there was just like, we're just part of life passing through very quickly. How can we, um, do the will of God, and bring love and peace to those around us, because we'll be quickly gone. We will, like the leaves of grass, we will pass. So, um, I think that was my. That's the. I mean, I threw a lot of ideas at you. Um, Talk about the religious society of friends. Yeah. Oh, so maybe that's a good way to end. So friends, so friends. We think of the Gospel of John. Jesus calls his disciples friends. I now call you friends. No longer are we in this student-teacher relationship. Um, and for early friends, touching on the the idea of Christ, the universal spirit, is very important. Um, and Quakers also had a very um, different understanding of who Jesus was. And so Quakerism, even the other branches of Quakerism, don't really have a Christology. Christology, I try to avoid theological terms, but a Christology is an idea about who Jesus was, because the Gospels themselves are fairly ambiguous. And Jesus says one thing, and there's the Gospel of Mark where people say, "But you're the Messiah." He's like, "Get behind me, Satan." Don't tell anybody. How do you know that? So there's all that ambiguity. But Quakers, we don't really have a theory of who Jesus was, and a Christology, if you will, which is why Quaker schools have been, which is why many non-Quakers and many people of non-Christian religions are attracted to Quaker schools, because we're not saying who Jesus was. And for early friends, Jesus showed through his righteous living that he was a son of God. Jesus wasn't righteous because he was born the Son of God. Jesus became righteous and then became the Son of God. That's a very legitimate way to understand. And that's the connection with the Gospel of John. I'm giving you a real condensed version, but that's the connection with the Gospel of John. So Jesus is constantly sort of going within and connecting to this Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of God. And as he goes through his own ministry, he is exhibiting this kind of righteousness. And early friends got in a lot of trouble because they would call themselves the sons of God and the sons of. They said, "Well, we're all children of God," and magistrates and others would say, "Well, what do you mean? Are you delusional? Are you having some kind of religious? Are you blaspheming?" That was even worse because you could be put in the stocks and pillories and all that. And there was a Quaker who was charged with blasphemy for reenacting a biblical story. His name was James Naylor. He was also an important founder of Quakerism along with George Fox. And he was tried in Bristol for blasphemy, and he had his tongue was bored through with a hot poker, and they tattooed a B on his forehead for blasphemy. Had a very, very sad. It's a very sad story, very sad chapter in the history of Quakerism. But it's also instructive because Quakers learned from that experience that religious excess could lead to destructiveness. So there are many people who conjecture that that was the beginning of the kind of what we call now gospel order, where there's a monthly meeting and a quarterly meeting and a yearly meeting, and we're in relationship with each other, and we try to do things a certain way. So that was when that religious excess, the Naylor incident, that things started to become more formalized for Quakers. Although that was a wild 30-year period from about 1660 to 1689, 1690. Very, very wild, tumultuous period. So the Gospel of John and calling each other friends, and that idea that when Jesus calls his disciples friends, meaning that there's a way to live that can bring you in this right relationship with God. And that of course is a tricky idea, and there's a lot to be said about that in the history of Quakerism, but we will not go into that because it's now 8:05, and why don't we take some questions? Anybody have any questions?
Georgia, I'd like to ask you a question.
Sure.
You were talking about John Woolman and his opposition to slavery, and while I completely agree with him, I'm wondering, since only 4% of Southerners were slave owners, and it's a Quaker doctrine you've described that each person listens to their own internal guidance, what was it in the Quaker structure that set up John Woolman to go around saying, let's stop this slavery stuff?
Excellent.
He was giving his inner guidance in contrariness to other people.
Excellent question, Lois. And the thing that was happening was what Quakers called the Lamb's War. So early Quaker writings are very much informed by the book of Revelation and the Gospel and the New Testament. And they were calling out sin and corruption. They were calling out. So we're also, that's part of our legacy as friends, and we have friends that do that to this day. Bertrand Russell, not Bertrand Russell, Bayard Rustin, rather. I'm sorry, but people, the angelic troublemakers, that was really a Bayard Rustin expression. And what John Lewis, what did he call it? Something about angelic troublemakers. So we need good troublemakers. So the world is not complete. things are not the way they should be. There's injustice, and 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 so fighting the lamb's war. Now, the lamb's war is an interesting image, of course, because if you've ever been around a lamb or sheep, you know they are the most defenseless, vulnerable creatures. So you're fighting this war non-violently, and you're using moral suasion. And this is what Lucretia Mott and others would talk about. We're not trying to, debate people about what's right and what's wrong. This truth is revealed to us, and we are using moral suasion, meaning our behavior, to show that this thing is wrong. And so Lucretia Mott was not, people would say to her, you're just this little woman. What are you going to do? And she's like, not a question. Don't care what the answer is. This is what I have to do. And people will see the way that I'm living. And that is that's called moral suasion. So, and this is it's a good question, because we often think of Quakers as being involved in social reform. I mean, certainly the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade was, Quakers were instrumental in that in England for the most part. And then, in America, it took a civil war, but, and, that's a whole complicated history. But so what Woolman was doing was by his life, he was trying to bring folks into what he felt was what had been revealed to him as a moral alignment with spirit, and that's what he did. But that's a very good question. The Lamb's War, looking at social institutions that are exploitative and unjust, and saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm part of this. So John Woolman, it wasn't that he sort of went and, he was living, there were plenty of slaves in South Jersey where he lived. His first experience was he's a very talented tailor, and he was also a very literate person. And he was asked to write a bill of sale for a slave. And this was somebody he knew, an old Quaker, said, hey, I'm going to, make this transfer of property. And John Woolman said, I can't do this. This is not property. This is a man. This is a human being. So that's one of the things that set him on this journey. But yeah, the old Lamb's War. And it's interesting to explore. Other questions?
I have a question.
Mhm.
So my question has to do with, what is your opinion of violence? What is violence according to you or the group?
Well, I would say, violence comes in many forms. The institution of slavery, certainly John Woolman felt, not only was that, it was enforced by violence, and it was a violent economic system. Before I get to John Woolman, I just, discovered the whole relationship between slavery as being chattel, meaning property. Then the growers in the South could use that property as collateral to get loans to buy more land to plant more cotton. So the banks in New York City and on Wall Street were part of that whole system. They were financing this whole thing. So I just, I guess I knew that, but it's an example of looking deeply at what seems to be an evil, but and as a form of violence, as a form of social violence. So, certainly there is physical violence, and I taught Quaker teenagers. We spent a year talking about nonviolence and violence, and of course, when you tell people that you're nonviolent and you're object to violence. People always say, well, what would you do if they create a scenario? What would you do if somebody came at you with an axe or was attacking your mother? You don't know what you would do, but you know that violence is not something that you would use as a way to get your will done. Using violence to get what you want is not for me, that's not going to be an option. I will witness to to the truth that we are all connected, and that if we all have that of God within us, if we're all part of the divine, then killing someone means killing the divine. I mean, the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, was, it's also embedded in this idea that everything is God. So by looking at violence as a way to achieve my means, it means that I'm separating God. I'm saying, okay, well, you people are not God, but I'm God. God's on my side and not yours, and therefore I can use violence to enact my will to get what I want. So that would be, and so this idea of humanity, that we're all connected. I mean, most Quakers and most of us that practice the spirituality come to an inner sense of oneness. So that oneness that we get, that mystical spiritual connectedness that we feel when we worship. I mean, if you extend that to the world, that's everyone. So we're all part of one another. There's no separating out. So I don't know if I answered your question, but in terms of, I don't know, in terms of personal violence, I would do whatever I could to avoid doing that. Now, it does raise interesting questions. Well, what about the military? What about police? And what about protection? What about safety in communities? And Quakers, we don't have a unified answer on that. But I know that my effort is going to be based on nonviolence. It's not, pacifism doesn't mean, and nonviolence doesn't mean, it's not a passive thing. It doesn't mean inaction. So it means working to make a more just society so that violence is not needed. Nancy? Yeah.
Erin, could you be more specific in your question?
Sure. So my question would be, what is considered violent? See, everybody has a different morality. Like, for example, I consider forcing somebody to express something against their will to be violent. So telling a child to go and hug Uncle so-and-so, I consider that an act of violence. Forcing children to sing Christmas carols when they don't want to, that's violent. Defending yourself against an attacker or protecting another person who's vulnerable, I don't see as violent, because the attacker forfeited their safety at that point. You're not doing it with the intention of harming them. You're doing it with the intention of stopping them from harming. That's where I'm coming from. I'm not from a safe neighborhood. I did the whole meek thing, pray to God, hope it gets better. I'm not living in the luxury of being able to rely on that. I had to learn to defend myself. I eventually did work in a school teaching young children to defend themselves against much larger attackers, abductors. I taught women self-defense. So I do feel that it is important to protect yourself, because if you are God and this is the temple, you should defend it. I'm not saying to go out with the intention of harming. The intention is to stop the attack and flee. So that's where my question would be, if this is a group where you must conform, possibly slash, allow certain things that you morally disagree with, I don't know if that would be for me.
Well, I thought maybe I hadn't been clear. We all, as Quakers, we all struggle as individuals with the testimonies, how we live into them, what our experience has been. There's no uniform answer to your question. We're all going to answer it differently. But but the commitment to nonviolence as a testimony is, it's pretty central, um, in that it's not a done, it's not a done deal. Like we don't have there's not a fixed way to do it. I mean, you know, um, a few years ago during the Iraq War, a Quaker from uh, Baltimore Yearly Meeting, uh, Tom Fox, uh, joined the Christian uh, peace team, and he was abducted, and eventually he was uh, beheaded by insurgents in Iraq. Um, and it's a very interesting. He was a very interesting person, and he had a very interesting take on what was happening to him. But again, there's there's not one answer, and I guess that the question would be um, struggling with it. Like what is it? What certainly, and if you've if you read Friend's Journal, and you can read it online, there's interesting. The last couple of issues, there's been an issue about policing and about mass incarceration, and so it's it's something that we explore, and we are interested in understanding alternatives. And Quakers have created a program called Alternatives to Violence, and I've been trained in it, and I've used it. Um, and it is sort of, I like to call it Quakerism in action, but it's something to explore if you're interested in that. But it certainly
I
is.
do have one last question.
Okay.
Are there Quakers within the group that are from not safe neighborhoods? Like if you call 911, no one comes. Are there people who are from those neighborhoods so that maybe I could ask them what their opinion would be?
Yeah. There are certainly young adult friends from all those neighborhoods. I mean, when I was young, I lived on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in an unsafe neighborhood, a drug infested, unsafe neighborhood. And I dealt with that. But yeah, there's a community of young adult friends. We called them YAFs, YAF, and they get together and they talk about these issues. And many of them live in West Philadelphia, sort of close to 54th Street, in that area where the neighborhoods and communities sort of on the edge of University City. And yeah, and I have 3 young adult children who have lived in places that were not the safest, and they dealt with it. So yeah, um, I don't know. Yeah, we do deal with it, and we're not all living securely in some you know uh, suburban enclave.
And we,
That's why I wanted to ask. Some of the groups that I've been in before, not Quakers, but as in looking for spirituality, a lot of them are from wealthy areas, and it's very easy for them to be like, oh, love and light, don't let anything impact my brain, I don't want any negativity, and thus they don't do anything. They're
Yeah,
just completely inactive, and they have the luxury to. They don't
yeah,
know what it's like to be faced with consequences. So
yeah,
that's what I'm seeking. I want to see what is the practicality of this faith.
yeah. That's really marvelous. And the you know the the shorter answer is it's a struggle. It's a search. I mean, the one thing about Quakerism, and this is an excellent point, we believe in continuing revelation, so that you know things are being revealed. Truth continues to be revealed. We don't have the answers all locked up and tidy. Um, where things are going to change, life is going to change, society will change. Um, you know, um, I mean, what happened around Black Lives Matter? Do we call that an uprising? Do we call it an insurgency? Do we call it rioting? Do we call it like how do we describe it? How do we understand it? Those are things that we're in dialogue about, that we talk about, and people have different points of view, and we're not, we're not looking for conformity of belief on issues.
Yeah. For what it's worth, Aaron, to give you a personal answer, I have been mugged. I am a member of my local town watch group. We don't hesitate to call 911 if we see someone we think is a threat.
Aaron, I could connect you to the YAF group if you would be interested.
Okay.
So since we're being recorded, Lois, do you have Aaron's email contact information that you could send me privately? Or I don't want to put it on the screen, I guess. I don't know how this really
I
works.
don't think the chat will be recorded. So if Erin would like to send you her email address in the chat, or just post it to all of us, you would get that, and I won't put it online.
Okay.
Okay, 1 minute.
Mm. And there is a history of Quakers and doing prison reform, and some of it didn't work out. I mean, Quakers have had a lot of ideas over the centuries. Some of them didn't quite work out as envisioned, and others did. But because Quakers in the early years, in the first 30 years, spent so much time in prison, that that we have a tradition of leading prison visitation, prison reform, and that sort of thing. So.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, just like, for example, it's still on my mind, but on New Year's, somebody was shot outside of my house and he bled to death. And my neighbors were shoving oven mitts and rags and things into the holes. And the whole neighborhood, well, we were trying, at least, my whole block was calling 911 and not a single person came. He died. Eventually, a car that it was just like a regular paddy wagon, they came and put him in the back of the car, and we knew he had no chance. So that's just an example of, like, when I'm saying, when you live in a place where no one is coming for you, you don't have that luxury, like, that's the reality I have. So I want to know, how do you apply that?
Yeah.
Like, personally, for me, I'm going to do anything I need to do, to stop somebody from imposing their will on me. But at the same time, I'm not going to walk around looking for ways to impose my will on others. So I really do feel like violence is an intent, not the act.
Mm-hmm. Well, I honor your truth. Yeah.
Aaron, do you think you could have stopped this happening?
What was that?
Do you think you could have stopped it happening? You could have stopped
No.
being murdered?
No, he was shot in a home around the corner and he fled. And I had closed my door as he was running, and my neighbor had her door slightly ajar, and he jumped into her threshold and fell, and there was just blood and chunks, and it was horrible. It was a horrible scene. So yeah, he was just moving on adrenaline. He was confused. The neighbors were trying to help him. He was trying to fight back because he was confused. We were calling 911 and no one came. However, they had tons of vans with cameras all over looking for any drunk people that might be out there without a mask on, because priorities. But a life was bleeding out on the street and into someone's home, and that same sort of attitude wasn't there. Like, I don't know. I feel like if we went out there celebrating and cheering without a mask on, people would have been there. But when we needed somebody the most, there was no one. So I
Yeah.
really feel like it's really up to us to really do what we have to do for ourselves, because we are on our own. Some of us anyway.
hmm Yeah. Well, I think, I think you're highlighting um, injustice as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, that's a real concern. And it really, when many friends meetings talk about peace, they talk about justice. So it's not just peace at any cost. It's the understanding that peace can only happen if there's justice. Um,
hmm
and what is that? What does justice look like, and how do we work to create a more just society that will foster that peace? That's probably the best way to put it, for me at least.
Right. Well, what I do is I'm peripherally involved with Moms Demand Action, which of course is all focused on changing the gun laws. I mean, this is one common misconception, that there's this monolith of Quakers who are all, supposed to do something. But actually what we are is a loose confederation of individuals who have individual leadings, which is right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're that and again, the reason we're called liberal Quakers is because the individual is not forced to conform to the group. That's, the individual and the group are two, um, they both are integral units that have their own integrity. And I mean, and it's a tension, it's a tension, it's a struggle. I mean, you'll find throughout Quakerism um, a lot of, a lot of struggle, and the wisdom that comes from the spiritual practice is understanding that yeah, we're all one humanity. We're all created in the eyes of God, um, as equal beings, and yet we all have individual histories and individual needs and individual destinies. And the wisdom of trying to balance those two, understand those two, live a life of integrity that honors both of those um, perspectives. Religion, you'll find, and spirituality especially, often involves holding the opposites, um, and working through the tension. And very often that tension creates something new. Every once in a while, something new and wonderful appears as we hold that tension of the opposites.
Aaron, are you in Philadelphia?
Yes.
Um, I would like you to come and visit our in-person worship and see if you find something there. We're starting to meet every week now, every Sunday. And you will not be turned away or judged because of what you said tonight. That's not who we are.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
did actually attend for about half a year, but then I became very sickly, and then COVID happened.
Oh,
so
gosh.
I didn't want to risk. And I did have COVID before they knew it was COVID, so I didn't want to bring it to anyone. So I just locked myself in for like 2 years.
Okay, well, I
have other conditions right now that I'm fighting.
Okay, I have to say, I really feel stupid when I just say things like I just did, because I sometimes just forget we're not living in COVID.
It's been a long time.
Okay.
And I was there during the winter, so I was probably bundled up a lot.
I think
All right. Well, if you would like to come and visit again, please do so.
I do miss you guys. I do miss being there. I did feel very recharged. going there. I didn't want to risk while I'm going through treatments right now. I'm having kind of a rough time right now, so
Okay.
I don't want to jeopardize possibly catching something or giving something to someone
Okay.
for now.
Okay.
But thank you.
Very cool dinosaurs.
Well,
Thank you.
maybe we should stop recording at this point.
Okay, yes.
Okay.
All right. Or unless you guys did you want to continue?
I'm going to